Hello, and welcome back to Philosophy 1050, an introduction to philosophy. This is Lecture 11. In today's lecture, we're going to be covering David Hume. Hume was born in Edinburgh, Scotland, to a strict religious family. After becoming of age, he attended university in his hometown, where he planned to become a lawyer. After discovering philosophy, however, he was hooked, and soon abandoned his plans of both being a lawyer and his religious faith in God. Now, after trying and failing in a few business pursuits, he went to France and studied at Descartes' old school, at his old university. And there he did his first work that he called a treatise on human nature. Although it wasn't received very well, so it didn't get a lot of the equivalent of likes back then. And so because of that, he kind of reworked it for a bit and re-released it later as an inquiry concerning human nature, which is what we're going to be reading today. So he went on to work as a librarian for some time while working on a book about religion, which he never actually published while he was alive because he was afraid of what the consequences would be if he did publish it. It was published after he died, but we will not be covering that work today because it would be a whole other class to talk about Hume's religious views. So finally, he never married, and he died of colon cancer, unfortunately, in 1776. So that's bit of Hume's biography. And before we get into the reading itself for today, let's just give it a little bit of a brief overview of Hume's views in general. So first we have Hume's theory of knowledge. Now Hume, as mentioned in the previous lectures, was known as an empiricist. If you recall, an empiricist is someone who thinks that the proper way to get knowledge is through observation, or in other words, through the senses, sight, touch, hearing, and so forth. Now, this movement that Hume kind of started later developed into something called positivism, and I'll write that down so you can see how it's spelt. Positivism. And the goal of, or not the goal rather, but one of the main tenets of positivism is that anything that doesn't have some sort of observation to correspond with it is in some sense meaningless. So we have this idea of meaninglessness. So what does it mean when something is meaningless? Well, like I just said, for the positivists and for Hume, for something like a term or an idea to be meaningless, it just means that there's no actual experience that corresponds to that idea. It's an idea that is made up seemingly without any real appeal to the observation of the real world. Now, because of that, Hume was in some sense a skeptic about a lot of things, but he wasn't a global skeptic. So we have here skepticism, and under that we have two types. We have local skepticism and we have global skepticism. Now, Hume isn't what's called a global skeptic. Now, what's a global skeptic? So an example that we could use, although it's a little bit shaky, and I'll explain a little bit later why, is Descartes. So in Descartes' meditations, he goes through this process of radical doubt, of doubting not just that there are things outside of himself, but even some of the more basic things like mathematics and so forth. And so a global skeptic is someone who doubts almost everything. Now, I say this is shaky because Descartes was doubting things only provisionally, and eventually he got out of that, so his final position doesn't really count as one of skepticism necessarily. And Hume wants to say that he is what's called a local skeptic, which means they only doubt specific things. Now, depending on which flavor of local skeptic, you'll doubt or believe different things. But Hume was a very specific kind of local skeptic. So he was doubtful of metaphysical propositions, or in other words, any sort of knowledge that at the time was being produced by philosophers that called themselves metaphysicians. And more specifically, even more, he doubted the kinds of propositions that were meaningless, that didn't correspond to any observations. And those ones, that can be said, rather, of metaphysics. And so Hume was a skeptic, but not about everything. He was a skeptic about a very local thing, specifically meaningless claims from metaphysics. And so, in other words, in short, he was a skeptic about metaphysics. Now, such propositions for Hume included things like the existence of a soul or a mind, the existence of free will, the existence of God, of miracles, of cause and effect, and of the sort of argument that we mentioned in our earlier lectures called induction. So he was a skeptic about all those things. For our purposes today, though, we're only going to be looking at the existence of free will, cause and effect, and induction. So just the last few. We're not going to be looking at Hume's view on the soul or God in this lecture. So one major thing to understand about Hume and the way that he understood the world is that he divided up our mental understanding of the world into two main categories, or rather our mental experiences. So we have, here, I'll get rid of this. For Hume, we have two main sort of mental happenings in our brain. We have impressions, and we have something called ideas. So, what are impressions and ideas? Well, impressions are sort of the first-hand experience that we have of things. So, when you see something, that counts as an impression because there's this sort of direct connectedness between your observation and the experience you're having. Whereas ideas are just copies of that. So now if I close my eyes and I imagined the pen in front of me, that would count as an idea instead of an impression. And this is just sort of the basic way that Hume cuts up the psychological landscape in order to make the points he wants to make. And we'll talk a little bit more about this when we get into the reading itself. So the argument that gained Hume arguably the most fame is his argument about the illusional nature of causality. So in brief, his argument is that we can see a cause and we can see an effect, but we never see the connection between the cause and effect. So let me draw something here. So let's say we have a billiard ball, right? And it's moving towards another billiard ball. And then we have a moment of contact. And then what happens? Well, typically, according to our experiences, what happens is if this is the setup, then the next frame is going to be something like this. Right? Well, Hume says that there's something very specific happening here. When this ball comes into contact with this ball, it's not as though we're seeing something happening there. We're just seeing this event, and then this event, and then this event, following one after the other. We're not actually seeing the way or the power, he calls it, that is making this happen. And again, we'll get more into this as we go on. But this is one of the main things to be said about Hume when we're kind of giving an overview. He doubted whether or not our observations of causality were actually observations, or if they were just some other sort of thing happening. So because we never actually see causality happening, it counts as one of those meaningless concepts. Remember meaninglessness from positivism? And at least in the sense that we have no real idea of it because we've never actually seen causality as such. We've only seen a succession of events. So instead, Hume says, our ideas of causality come from the habits that our minds form when they're sort of accustomed to seeing events lined up in a particular order. Well, when the mind sees this happening, well, it expects this to happen, and then when this happens, the mind already expects, because it has a habit of seeing this follow it, it expects this one. So basically, the whole way through, it's just a function of habit of the mind. It's nothing more than that. And again, we'll get more into this later. Now, here's another main sort of bit about Hume. And this is, it's known by different things, but here let's just call it the circular defense of induction. So Hume argues that the reasoning we use to establish cause and effect, like in the case of those billiard balls, does not have any actual rational basis, again, because we don't have any observations about it. The standard inductive argument goes something like this. X, oh dear, my pen is running out. X has led to Y n times. So that's the first step of any inductive argument. You say that this has happened, X caused Y, this many times. I've seen it happen this many times. The next step is just the conclusion. Therefore, X leads to Y. So this is basically what induction is. You observe things like X being followed by Y, and then you make some sort of general rule up, like X leads to Y, or X causes Y. But the problem is, how do we justify this step right here? That's what Hume is really concerned about. And he wants to say that one thing that we can't do is say that using this sort of reasoning in the past has worked. Because notice what you're doing then if you try to make that argument. Well, then you're basically saying something like, induction has led to truth many times. Right? So that's your first step when you're trying to say that this sort of reasoning has worked in the past. And then the next step is, therefore, induction leads to truth. And notice how this is a circular defense. You're using the very sort of reasoning that you're trying to justify in order to justify that reasoning. So Hume says this isn't any real rational basis. This isn't an option. Now, he says that not only can induction itself not justify itself, but deduction can't justify induction. Because induction is not what's called deductively valid. Now, what does deductively valid mean? Well, it means that here above this line we have the premise, and below this line we have 3 dots, the conclusion. And deductively valid just means that anything that is a premise, if all the premises were true, then this would have to be true. So a quick example would be like, if P therefore Q and P, then Q must be true. There's no way for P therefore Q and P to be true without Q also being true. So this is what's known as deductively valid. And Hume is saying that that just doesn't apply here when we're talking about inductive. There's nothing about seeing something happen a bunch of times that guarantees that it's going to happen again in the future in the same way. One nice example of this is the example of ravens. So let us imagine that you've only seen black ravens, or crows, or whatever, it doesn't matter. So all your life, you've seen a lot of crows, you've seen a lot of ravens, and all of them have been black, each and every single time. And so you might conclude from that all ravens are black. This seems like a reasonable inference on the face of it, but at any moment the existence of an albino raven, so albinism is a condition in certain animals that basically makes them have reduced skin pigment, and actually people can have albinism as well. But in any case, so now picture that a white crow flies by. Well, now suddenly, even though you've seen crows be black a whole bunch of times, now your conclusion is shattered because you've seen a crow that wasn't black. Now, as mentioned, Hume also had some very strong philosophical positions about religion. However, we're not going to be focusing on those today because that would basically take a whole other class or a whole other lecture in order to properly delve into. Today, we're just going to be focusing on his epistemological views. Now, with all that said, let's begin with the reading for today, an inquiry concerning human reasoning. So, before I do that, let me just clean this up a little bit. Okay. So the first thing that Hume does is set the tone by discussing an adjacent but closely connected topic, which is moral philosophy. So he wants to say that there are two kinds of moral philosophy. There is philosophy concerned with action, and then there is philosophy concerned with understanding. So what are these two things? Well, philosophy concerned with action is similar to the sort of virtue ethics that we saw in Aristotle. It is a philosophy that is concerned with making people better in the real world, and thus having an immediate impact. Such philosophies focus on how we form habits. Now, this is going to be a key word for Hume. Habits. So Hume is saying that moral philosophy about action, now I'm just basically saying philosophy concerned with action or philosophy concerned with understanding, but at this point in the paper he's just talking about moral philosophy specifically. And he's saying that this one that's concerned with action is more in the world and lively. The philosophy concerned with understanding, however, is interested in establishing a theoretical basis for our moral judgments. It moves from particular instances or judgments and moves up to make more and more general judgments about those. Ultimately seeking to find some sort of ultimate general principle that can describe everything that happens inside of a moral context. So they're kind of like, if we think back to Midgley, they're the sort of philosophers that aren't so much applied philosophers, but rather theoretical philosophers, the ones that are up in their ivory towers thinking about things without actually going out into the world to sort of do things. Now, this sort of philosophy, therefore, Hume says, is concerned with basically gaining the approval of other wise people. So it's wise people trying to, compete with other wise people to see who can get things the most right. But it's not necessarily like competition so much as it is a collaborative effort. In any case, Hume now switches his language to discuss the easy and obvious philosophies versus what he calls the abstruse and accurate philosophies. Now, in this case, it seems that Hume is saying something like the philosophy of concerned with action is the one that's relatively easy and one sec here. Easy and obvious. Abstruse and accurate. Now, what does he mean by abstruse? He basically just means something like abstract or hard to sort of grasp at. It's something that's kind of arcane, sort of not common sense. So that's what he's trying to say. It's the easy and obvious philosophy versus the difficult and not so obvious philosophy. Now, he says that this sort of philosophy is easy to communicate. Easy to communicate. Whereas this one is difficult to communicate. And at this point, he's basically saying that, when you're in a social gathering, when you're dealing with an easy philosophy that deals with action or sort of common sense principles, then it's easy to talk to other people at a party about it. Whereas if you're talking about something very arcane and abstract, then it's a little bit harder to pull people in, where you're like, okay, well, hear me out here. I have this metaphysical principle, and it's brought out by a 3-series process of examining my own mind through this blah blah blah, right? So it's not as obvious and therefore not as easy to communicate at a party. And Hume wants to say that people basically prefer these ones because not only are they more easy, but they are therefore more useful in daily life. Whereas something like a very abstract philosophy isn't necessarily useful in your daily life. And not only that, but there's this other component of how impactful they are. So because these are easy to grasp and so forth, they can kind of grab you emotionally much easier than something like that. And Hume basically says that there's several philosophers that are, abstract philosophers, but as soon as they get into the real world, suddenly the real world dissolves all of their conclusions that they gained from their abstract philosophy, because in some ways it doesn't hold stick as well as it could, or as well as the other sort of philosophy does. It's this sort of philosophy that, because there's nothing for it to grab onto, as soon as you're put into a real situation, you kind of forget about it. And another thing, so the philosophy of action, as I mentioned, is based on things like common sense. Whereas the philosophy of understanding can go beyond common sense, or even against common sense. And for that reason, Hume says that if a philosophy of action, or an easy and obvious philosophy, goes wrong, then it can only go as wrong as common sense is already wrong. Whereas philosophy that is chasing understanding, or an abstruse and accurate philosophy, it can go beyond the common sense, and so therefore it can be far wronger than common sense. Hume then goes to state some sort of strong opinions about who's going to be remembered and who isn't, but he doesn't get it very right. he seems to be basing it on this sort of division here, and he's saying that these people are going to be remembered, whereas these people won't. But the names he lists aren't necessarily right, because he seems to put Locke in this category, whereas Locke is actually a very well remembered philosopher in today's day and age. So Hume got that wrong. Now, as mentioned, Hume wants to say that the easy philosophies are the ones that are easy to communicate. And that is important, says Hume, because we're not just rational animals, as some philosophers might have it, but we're also social animals, and we're animals concerned with action. So, Hume is basically saying that philosophies that fall under this category sort of discard those aspects of the human. They discard the social aspect and the active aspect and focus only on the rational. Whereas this one, because it brings in the active and the social, it can fulfill a person more. He even says something like, it's as though nature is punishing those that ignore the social and active parts of their humanity through mental difficulty and disconnection through society. Now, Hume switches gears at this point to discuss an important question. And that question is, should metaphysical questions be abandoned? This is in some sense the main question of his overall project. Even though, as Hume just established, doing abstract metaphysics can be fatiguing or, socially disconnect you from people, this could possibly be justified if the result of doing metaphysics produced some good fruit or some good results, in other words. The real problem is that, according to Hume, metaphysics is a source of inaccuracy and uncertainty. And he's saying that that's the real reason why metaphysics or metaphysical questions should perhaps be, if not completely discarded, then certainly trimmed down quite a lot. The pursuit of certain metaphysical questions results from human vanity, or, in other words, to use Descartes' terms, the will reaching farther than the understanding's ability to understand. Hume, in this work, wants to establish exactly how far that domain of the understanding spreads, and to show that many of the metaphysical questions that people have tried to answer in the past, like is there a God or is there cause and effect, just simply can't be answered because they are beyond that domain of potential understanding. Metaphysical philosophies are also wrapped up in several layers of tradition and superstition, and because of that they're often shielded from criticism because of these popular traditions or superstitions that they have built into their very structure or into the story they're telling about the world. And Hume says that intelligent people will continue to pursue these metaphysical questions, even going as far as being encouraged by past failures, until it is shown that answering these metaphysical questions is completely impossible, because it goes beyond the human understanding. And that's in some ways what he's trying to do here. He's trying to demonstrate that these questions are impossible to answer. Thus, only careful reasoning can be a remedy for abstruse philosophy and metaphysical jargon, says Hume. Such clear reasoning is required in order to cut through the shield of superstition and tradition that metaphysics, or at least metaphysics in Hume's time, would build up around itself. So, to begin this effort, Hume starts by saying that it is important to clarify the parts of the mind and how they work. Since a science of describing the mind must be considered possible, says Hume, otherwise thou throw us into global skepticism, which, as we mentioned earlier, is unacceptable to Hume, or just at least isn't the position he wants to take. So therefore there must be some sort of science of the mind that can happen. Otherwise it would be, as he says, subversive to all speculation. So it remains to establish that understanding, and that's what he sets out to do in section 2. So I'm gonna, right here, section 2. That's the symbol for a section. It's like two S's overlapped each other. You don't have to know that, but it's handy. So in section 2, titled On the Origin of Ideas, Hume starts by saying there's a difference between feeling love and remembering or anticipating the feeling of love. And the same thing goes for something like heat. There's a difference between actually feeling heat and remembering or anticipating the feeling of heat. So this brings us back to our distinction here that I mentioned earlier between impressions and ideas. Hopefully the green is better. Now, he says that when we remember or anticipate, it can't match the forcefulness or the vividness that happens to us when we actually feel or experience something. It's not vivid enough to trick us into thinking that the thing that we're anticipating or remembering is actually real. So, under this distinction here, impressions are very vivid and forceful, whereas ideas are not vivid, not forceful. They don't convince us that they're real, whereas impressions do. So, if we are to summarize these things, then here are some of the things we could say. Ideas are about things. They are taken to be a copy, in some sense, of impressions, and they are not limited to physical reality. So in other words, you can imagine anything that you want to imagine. Impressions, on the other hand, as we've mentioned, are vivid, are forceful. They are experiences or sensations that you can't help, that you can't deny, basically. They are taken to be real. They're taken to represent real things out there in the world, as opposed to ideas, which are taken to be just a mere copy of what's out there in the world. And lastly, impressions are limited by physical reality. Now, the mind's ability to be creative is supported by things brought to it by the senses, in this way sort of like building blocks. Here Hume gives the example of gold mountain or virtuous horse. These are things that we've had impressions of, and because we've had impressions of, we can make a copy of those impressions and then take those copies, now in the form of ideas, and put them together in any way we want to create things like gold mountain and virtuous horse. This leads to a view that Descartes says that he discarded in his meditations. So Hume is saying that he believes this view. And the view is that nothing exists in the mind which wasn't previously in the senses. Hume challenges anyone to find a counterexample, an example of an idea which was not first in some ways perceived through the senses. You can try to imagine some new and unusual thing, but inevitably, says Hume, whatever you imagine is going to be some sort of like Lego brick, piece by piece conglomeration of things that you have experienced in the past. Now, he goes on to give a supporting argument for this. People blind from birth cannot conceive of colors. Like, they can't even imagine what color is. And this shows that our ideas are dependent on having impressions first. So, in order to drive this home, let me actually put an arrow here. Impressions, once you've had them, become ideas. And blind people, because they've never had an impression of color, cannot have an idea of color. And Hume says, see, this proves my point. Same thing goes with deaf people. Deaf people don't have a concept of music, or at least a lot of them don't. And again, specifically talking about the ones that were that way from birth, so they never had a chance to experience it. Now, people often use words as though they have an idea of things, but they never had the impression to go with that idea, and so they don't have what Hume calls a proper idea of that thing. Even given impressions, our corresponding ideas can be imperfect. Like, for example, our ideas of a specific shade of color. If you were to say that, oh yeah, I like that color, let's say it's the color of your room and it's a blue wall, and then you go to a paint store and they show you a bunch of blues that look the same because you forgot the name of the particular color, and you look at them all, and that's when you realize that you actually don't have that great of an idea of exactly which blue it is, because clearly any one of these could be it and you're not sure which one it is. And that's what Hume is trying to point out about our ideas. Sometimes we say we have ideas about something, but they don't have any impressions, and so they're not proper ideas. And other times we do have impressions of them, but our ideas are so imperfect that they're not really that great anyway. So Hume says that all abstract ideas are faint and obscure. They are liable to being confused with other ideas, just like the color, as we mentioned. But impressions are the opposite. Impressions are vivid and clear. They're unmistakable. And so they can't be confused with each other. So, Hume says, to determine if an idea has meaning, all you need to do is ask, what's the impression that it is paired to? If there is no sense impression that is paired with that idea, then that idea is meaningless. And again, as we keep in mind, that is something that the positivists really picked up and rolled with later on. So, from there, he moves on to section 3, on the association of ideas. So in section 3, Hume continues on to discuss what relationships ideas might have with each other, what associations they might have, as he calls it. Hume notes that there are connections between ideas that cause them to present other ideas with some degree of method and regularity, with some sort of order. In language, for example, words hang together in an ordered way such that it's obvious that some sort of connection exists between those words. There's some sort of association of ideas going on there. So Hume proposes to enumerate what these associations between ideas can be. And he gives us 3 things: resemblance, contiguity, and cause and effect. So Hume says that these are the only 3 associations of ideas. Now, before I go on, let me say a bit about what these are. Well, resemblance is an association between ideas where the mind, let's say you have an idea of this green pen here, and then you have an idea of this black pen here. Well, there is some sort of resemblance between these two pens. It is easy for your idea, or rather for your mind, to go from the idea of this pen to the idea of this pen, because there's a resemblance between them. What about contiguity? Well, contiguity, the full thing is contiguity in space and time. Well, that just basically means you're either in the same place as something, or you're at the same time as something. You're contiguous with something. So, for example, when you think of Paris, you think of France. When you think of, let's say, Christmas, you think of December. There's certain connectedness between ideas that happens because of the way they are, in some ways, nested in the same place or time. And lastly, we have cause and effect, and this is the one that Hume is really going to harp on in our reading today. So Hume says it's impossible to definitively prove that these connections exist, are the only ones that exist. But we can gain some confidence that this is all there is to it by just going through a bunch of different test cases and seeing whether or not these are enough to explain those test cases. And with that, he concludes section 3, and now moves on to section 4. Here he presents skeptical doubts concerning the operations of the understanding. And this one, like another one that comes later, is split into 2 parts. So, part 1. So, I'm just going to take these down here. And these as well. Now, he says in section 4, part 1, all objects of the human understanding come in types. And these types are relations of ideas and matters of fact. Now, relations of ideas are things like math, algebra, geometry, things that basically just connect through purely the ideas. Matters of fact, however, are discoverable through evidence, through actual observation. And, says Hume, the contrary of a matter of fact is always possible. So, in a relation of idea, it's not possible for the interior angles of a triangle on a flat surface to not equal 180 degrees. Whereas with a matter of fact, it is possible for, I don't know, let's say, the sun not to rise tomorrow. That's the example that Hume says. There's nothing logically contradictory about it. Or there's nothing logically contradictory about me throwing my pen up and the pen just continues going up. We can easily imagine it, and therefore it's logically possible. Now, he wants to say that as far as evidence goes, and evidence goes to deal with matters of fact or establish matters of fact, all reasoning concerning matters of fact depends on the relation of cause and effect. So when we make a reasoning that leads to a matter of fact, we're using the relationship between ideas he identified as cause and effect. It is only by this tool that we can go beyond the direct knowledge of our senses. And judgments of this kind include stuff, and he gives a few examples here. Finding a watch on an island, well, that tells us that there must have been people on that island. Or hearing an intelligent discourse in the dark tells you that there's probably an intelligent being there, because only an intelligent being could have caused those sounds of an intelligent discourse. that feeling fire, or feeling heat rather, there must be fire. So there's these different things that we reason about in matters of fact, but when we reason about them, we're basically always appealing to causality in some degree or other. So we must investigate into this matter of cause and effect, says Hume. What is cause and effect? Well, knowledge of this kind is not arrived at a priori. And what is a priori? And we'll cover this a little bit more in our next lecture about Kant, but just briefly, there's this distinction between a priori and a posteriori. Now, this basically just means knowledge that you can gain before appealing to the senses, and knowledge that you can only gain after appealing to the senses. So, a priori knowledge is something like this. You don't need to actually see a triangle in real life in order to be taught the mathematical principles. And so before actually experiencing it, you can know a priori that a triangle has certain properties. Conversely, for a posteriori, I hate saying that word, there are things that you have to actually go out there and find out in order to have that knowledge. So, again, Hume is saying that knowledge of cause and effect cannot be arrived at a priori, it must be arrived at a posteriori, or in other words, through the senses. We gain this knowledge by finding certain objects or events regularly conjoined with each other. We couldn't infer causal properties through pure reason alone just by examining what an object is. We can't do it like the way we would for a triangle. So reason, unassisted by experience, cannot draw conclusions about matters of fact. This is true even of the simplest forms of causality. If we think back to the billiard ball example, where we have the two billiard balls, there's no actual point where you see in between the billiard balls the magic happening that causes one billiard ball to move the other. So how would someone predict an effect without appealing to the senses? By appealing to reason alone? You cannot find the effect already in the cause by using your reason, because by definition the cause and the effect have to be different things. So you can't just see what's already there and know what is gonna be there, because what's gonna be there is different from what's there right now. Or in other words, just because you see this and then this, it doesn't tell you that the next step is going to be this. It could be this, or it could be this, or it could be this, or this, or this, right? There's no logical connection there that makes it required by logic that this is how billiard balls are supposed to move. And example that he uses is, there's nothing in the stone that tells us that it's going to move downwards rather than upwards or sideways. Reason cannot tell an effect from all of the other possible events that could happen. As I said, there's a whole bunch of different ways that a billiard ball could move when it's struck, but presumably there's only one that actually happens. Therefore, Hume concludes, one should not investigate cause and effect without appeal to the observation. And this may seem pretty obvious, but back then there was quite a lot of people trying to establish certain ideas about causality without actually going out there and making observations. And Hume says that the smart philosophers, the rational and modest philosophers, don't make this mistake. They actually don't pretend to show the ultimate reason behind some event always following another. He says we can find general causes, or at least seem to find general causes, but we can't find the general causes of those general causes. So if our general causes are things like elasticity, gravity, cohesion of parts, communication of motion by impulse, those things we could maybe have as far as like rules of thumb, but we're never going to have some sort of overarching thing that connects them, at least according to Hume. Hume makes the point of saying that we could be happy and leave it at this, but he wants to continue in more detail. So he says, knowledge of geometry may help move things in the world, but this is only because it appeals to the aid of experience. If we didn't have experience about the world, we wouldn't be able to use geometry to make, buildings and stuff like that. We're only able to make buildings because we have the aid of experience. So now, Hume moves on to part 2 of section 4. So here he says that reasoning of matters of fact, as he established, depend on our ideas of cause and effect. And our ideas of cause and effect depend on the reliability of our experience. But what does the reliability of our experience depend upon? Well, Hume basically at this point again wants to say, I don't want to go down the global skeptic route. Because that would just take him too far afield. He wouldn't be able to actually get anything done if we start questioning things like, well, how do I know I'm actually seeing these things? Maybe I'm being tricked or something like that. He wants to set that aside and just say, it just is, okay? Just leave it alone. Let's start here. Now, Hume wants to say that even if we appeal to our experiences in order to figure out cause and effect, we're not actually using any sort of step of reasoning. No rational connection. There is this gap here that Hume wants to say between our actual experiences and our knowledge of cause and effect. There's no known connection between the sensible qualities and their secret powers, as he calls them, to make things happen. Hume at this point uses the example of the nutritiousness of bread. Bread has some properties like being squishy, being vaguely beige or golden brown, smelling a certain way, and so forth. But none of these things would allow you to infer that bread is actually nutritious for you. It's only your experience that makes you think that. Experience gives information, though, only about particular experiences, about particular instances. So why should we extend our expectations drawn from experiences to other cases that only merely resemble those things? So we see one case where X happens, and then we see Y follow. And then we see another case where we think X is happening, so we expect Y to follow. Why do we do that? Asks Hume. Well, ultimately, he wants us to understand, like I said, that there is a leap happening here. There's a gap to be filled that connects you between your experience and your knowledge of cause and effect. So, and as I mentioned earlier, X had affects Y, leads people to conclude that X always has affects Y. And we seem to do this, but there's actually a leap happening between this knowledge that we saw something happening and this knowledge that we can predict something is going to happen. And the thing that Hume says, and really even people in common society today, is that a lot of people don't realize that. A lot of people don't realize that there is a leap occurring when we say a particular cause had a particular effect. Hume sets about purportedly enumerating all the branches of human knowledge to show that none of them can provide this reasoning. And he says that there's two main branches. So let me get rid of this here. So the two branches are demonstrative reasoning and moral reasoning. So demonstrative reasoning deals with matters of fact, whereas moral reasoning deals with matters of demonstrative reasoning deals with relations of ideas, and moral reasoning deals with matters of fact and existence. So demonstrative reasoning can't help us figure out what this step here is, because supposing an opposite effect or state of affairs is never contrary. Like we said, there's no real logical contradiction if things were to go differently. We can perfectly well imagine it. So moral arguments, conversely, appeal to cause and effect to establish their conclusions. But if the problem is that because they depend on cause and effect, then moral reasoning can't be used to then support cause and effect. This goes back to our circular defense of induction. By appealing to moral reasoning in order to justify induction, you'd be making a circular argument, or in other words, begging the question of why induction is useful. In truth, it's only the relation of resemblance between objects that induces us to infer similarity in the effects. If our inferences of cause and effect were based on reason, the first experience of an object would be enough to form a perfect judgment. So, if we saw, for example, a triangle, and we were perfectly rational beings with super fast thinking or processing power, we could just look at a triangle and immediately deduce that all of the angles need to add up to 180 degrees, and we would know that instantly. But with something like, let's say, an apple, we can't just look at an apple and be immediately know what's going to happen because of the apple, or any other object for that matter. With cause and effect, you need many experiences, says Hume, in order to properly build up some sort of idea of what's going to follow from something. Thus, it is a kind of reasoning that changes based upon the amount of nearly identical assumptions. And that's just not how normal reasoning works. So, in other words, the main belief behind all of this is the idea that the future will resemble the past. So this is kind of the primary hidden belief there that nobody seems to be talking about, says Hume. But what is this based on? It can't be based on experiments, as experiment relies on this belief to establish things, so it would be circular. It can't be based on experience, because causal properties can change while their sensible properties remain the same. This happens in some things, like in a magnet that becomes demagnetized. So, says Hume, why can't it happen in other things? Why can't the thing look the same, but suddenly, unbeknownst to us, because seemingly nothing has changed, actually there is some sort of causal property change that has happened within it, unbeknownst to us? Another clear proof that cause and effect has nothing to do with reason is the fact that children learn from experience, but obviously they don't have any sort of complicated reasoning process or rationalization. So the justification for this step is either something so simple and unspeakable, or it's something that just doesn't exist. There's no actual rational step being taken there. And that brings us to section 5. Part 1. So here Hume begins to talk about the philosophy that he chiefly subscribes to, skepticism. Skepticism is a species of philosophy which centers around withholding judgment from certain questions, specifically the questions that someone isn't certain about. Hume says that skepticism makes very few friends by not backing up anybody's strong beliefs, but it also makes a lot of enemies by criticizing people for having strong beliefs. But Hume wants to make sure that we don't accuse him of global skepticism, so he says that common sense is much more powerful than any sort of skeptical arguments. He says that nature will always overrule abstract reasoning. Even his previous example about causality wouldn't cause anyone, including himself, to act any differently. We still act in our day-to-day lives as though causality is a true and obvious thing, as though there were an arrow here. So he switches to having us imagine someone with total amnesia, but nevertheless a grown and rational mind. So it's not like they're a child or were just born or something. They have the capability of language, they just don't have any real narrative memories. So if they were to pop into existence, they wouldn't be able to judge that there is cause and effect, let alone which causes pair with which effects. After some time, that person may start associating things, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they've grasped causality. Correlation doesn't equal causation. This is one of the most basic things you can learn in, for example, a statistics class. Drownings, for example, are correlated with ice cream sales. As ice cream sales go up, drownings go up. But it's quite obvious that eating ice cream doesn't cause you to drown. So even though these two things are correlated, one isn't causing the other. So Hume continues, this person with amnesia would ultimately not be confident enough to assign any certainties to anything. The only thing they could be certain of is what they're seeing right here and right now. Finally, after much time of this amnesiac spending time in the world, they would be able to form some strong associations between events in a way that seems to track causality. But those associations would be there only due to habit. Now he goes on and he sets out what he calls the habit or the custom principle. So he says a habit is a repeated action not caused by a process of reasoning. Hume says that this is all we need to explain causal beliefs, like fire causing heat or weight pairing with solidity. All inferences from experience, therefore, arise from habit. Such inferences require observations, and from those observations we are led by habit to infer certain other things. For example, and I like this from Hume, pompous buildings we are in the habit of associating with civilization. So when we see a pompous building, our mind is in the habit of bringing up as the next thought civilization. And Hume says that he'll give more elaboration and examples to explain this, which brings us to part 2. Excuse me 1 second. Part 2. So although the mind can't produce its own original ideas, it can combine and separate these ideas to form innumerable new ideas. So we can decide to imagine anything we want, but we can't as easily decide to believe anything we want. So for example, it's easy for us to imagine a horse with the head of a man, but it's not easy for us to actually believe that such a horse with a head of a man exists out there somewhere. So Hume is pointing out that there is some important difference happening here in between the impressions side of it and the ideas side of it. Belief requires some sort of extra sentiment or feeling, says Hume, and this is the same sort of sentiment or feeling that we get when we perceive something with our senses, when we have a sense impression. And he calls the name of this extra sentiment belief. Now, in other words, and he gives us a definition here, belief is a more vivid, firm, or forceful conception of an object which imagination alone could not provide. It's impossible to properly explain what belief is, but Hume says if you want to experience it, just look around you. This feeling you're getting by looking around and having beliefs about what's around you, that's just what belief is. Now, Hume says that the mind reaches a greater conception of things through observation. A resemblance can enliven a mind's idea of a thing. Contiguity can make ideas stronger or less strong. And cause and effect can cause ideas to have correlated objects. The reasoning concerning matters of fact and existence hinges on our relating ideas of one object that is present to, Reasoning concerning matters of fact and existence hinge on our relating one object that is present to another object that is or will become present. So that's basically the entire basis of any of our day-to-day reasoning. And these associations, he says, we make by habit. So Hume concludes this part of his reasoning in section 5. So, reasoning concerning matters of fact is not deductive, as deduction is slow and possible only in adults, and is infallible. Whereas induction, conversely, is quick, possible in all humans, even children, and is fallible. Sometimes induction goes wrong. Hume then goes on to address some other issues like probability. And he does this in section 6. So Hume wants to say, like Aristotle did at one point, that chance is not itself a cause, but rather it's the result of ignorance, and so it's treated like a cause. Our thinking about chance as a cause makes our beliefs also be expressed in terms of probabilities. So there's a significant difference between, for example, 2-to-1 odds, or in other words, flipping a coin, and 100-to-1 odds. We clearly can be more confident in our bet of the flip of the coin than we can be in our bet of a 1 in 100 chance. And so Hume wants to say that our beliefs are sort of similar to this. The way that this works in the mind is more frequently drawn to the events that it more frequently experienced in the past. And this matches our earlier definition of belief. It's something which gives us a greater conception than what the imagination could have done on its own. Because knowing about the configuration of a dice allows you to have a greater conception of what will happen than what your imagination could have done on its own. So sense impressions are basically still required to see how the dice is laid out, but after that your mind kind of does this extra step of setting out different probabilities. Therefore, he says, when we transfer knowledge from the past to the future, we also transfer knowledge about all of the alternate effects that could have happened. So let's say that you're watering a plant, right? And you're trying to remember all of the previous times you've watered a plant. Well, most of the times that you've watered a plant, the plant has stopped wilting and perked back up. But a few times when you watered a plant, it got even worse. So you're not going to discard those memories. You're going to bring them in as a potential or a probability that could happen if you water the plant right now. Lastly, Hume goes on to address the idea of necessary connection, and he uses an X in this word because, I don't know, English was different back then, I guess. Or, in other words, to put it in more modern terms, logical necessity. Hume starts by noting that math differs from moral studies in that objects of math, being sensible, are always clear and determinate. Small distinctions in math are always very obvious. There's a very obvious distinction between 2 and 3. There's no vagueness going on there. And lastly, the same terms in math stand for the same things. There's no confusion going on about what word means what. There's always a very standard interpretation of what words mean in mathematics. Conversely, with moral studies, which has to do with the passions, less certainty is possible. The passions escape analysis by reflection and become ambiguously defined, so people start using the same word to refer to different things. Hume says that different fields are impeded by different issues. So metaphysics is impeded by the ambiguity of its terms and the obscurity of its ideas. Mathematics is impeded by the length of the inferences, because if you've ever seen a mathematical proof, you know, they can be very, very long. And he says the compass of thought that is required to do math, that's another thing that impedes it. And for natural philosophy, what impedes that is the want of proper experiments and phenomena. So in other words, here Hume is saying that what's holding science back is the fact that it's just not making enough observations fast enough. But he wants to say specifically in metaphysics, there exists some particularly obscure and uncertain ideas. These are ideas like power, like force, like energy, and like necessary connection. So he goes on now to address this idea of his called necessary connection. So knowledge of a necessary connection requires a sensibly discoverable power or energy to produce a particular effect. So here we can imagine what he's trying to look for here. So we can imagine we have a watch. And, you know, the watch reads a certain time and it's ticking away and it's moving. And we want to say something like, what's causing this watch to move? Well, we can crack it open. We can crack open the watch, and inside of the watch, let me use green because it's a little bit more visible, we have, you know, a bunch of gears. These are the worst gears ever drawn, but yeah. And then, so that's another layer of the explanation. So we go from the watch is doing its thing to the gears are moving and in a certain way, and that's what's causing the watch to move. Well, we can take it a step further and ask what's causing the gears to move. So we can zoom in, and then now we have something like, let's say this is a gear here, a nice zoomed in version, and then here we have, oh geez, that's really terrible. There we go. So we have a gear here and a gear here, and we can say that, oh, well, it's actually, if you see here, the gear, one gear is pushing on the other, but then we can take it a step further again, and we can zoom in onto the gears touching each other. So here's one gear, and here's another gear, and we can say, oh well, right here there's like a pushing, there's a pushing force happening, and then we can take it further again and then say, oh well, there's these particles, and the particles are repelling each other, and we can do it again. Well, what's the connection between the repelling and the particle, and so on and so forth. And at no point are we actually seeing the causality. We're just seeing more and more specific parts, or in other words, more and more specific kind of like snapshots that follow one another, but we're not actually seeing the power or the force that goes into it, the thing that is making a necessary connection between one thing happening and the other. Hume thus says that the scenes of the universe are continually shifting, but the power or force that makes these things appear as they do is not visible within the senses. This is not unlike the shadow parade from Plato's allegory of the cave, where prisoners had no idea what was actually making the shadows appear in the order that they were appearing. And, we can imagine that the prison guards that are holding up the figures to the fire might actually screw around with them. So, for a whole month, they'll do something like have a sculpture of a sheep, and then a sculpture of a wolf, and then a sculpture of a sheep, and a sculpture of a wolf, to the point where every time the prisoners see the sculpture of the sheep, they expect the sculpture of the wolf. But, there's no actual rule about that. The prison guards could just as easily then switch it up and do something like the sculpture of a sheep, and then the sculpture of another sheep, and then no wolf, right? And so, because of that, Hume is just trying to get us to really zoom in and understand that there's no causality that we're actually seeing. We're only seeing a succession of events. Hume now goes on to address arguments about the evidence of causality found in our own freedom of will, or supposed freedom of will. He says we believe ourselves to have a power, free will, which allows us to cause our body to move and our minds to pay attention to certain things. But this requires that we give a real account of free will and the mind-body connection, which nobody has been successful in doing so far. And arguably, that is still the case today, although this discussion has evolved quite a bit since then. The problem, says Hume, is that there's no real knowledge here. Why, for example, can the mind move the fingers and the tongue, but it can't move the heart and the liver? Or, says Hume, what about people with paralysis? The mind seems to be completely impotent there. And so an answer to this would be available if we had some actual real knowledge about how free will works and how the mind is connected to the body, but we don't. So we're not able to say why it is that we can control certain things and not others. Therefore, the will is only known through experience and the connectedness of certain events to it. When I want to move my hand up, my hand moves up. And those are just one thing following the other. Now, even giving a knowledge of anatomy, some bare explanations such as the nerves, or at that time the spirits in the body making the body do things by communicating the signals from the mind, it still remains mysterious as why the command of the will must be followed any more than why the sun must rise. There's still like this gap there for why it must happen that way. Thus, even our belief in free will is due to mere habit. We're just in the habit of seeing things happen as though we had free will. Now, our seeming ability to impose our will varies in potency and success, says Hume. Hume uses the example of how people in the morning are seemingly less willful than they are later on in the day. You're less able to pull yourself out of bed because you really don't want to, whereas later on in the day it's very easy to get up and off of the chair. Indeed, people often are comfortable to assign causes to common phenomena, But unexpected phenomena is often treated as the result of some sort of divine will. So this leads us to the other sort of defense of causality that Hume wants to shut down. People are in fact ignorant in both cases, says Hume, both in the cases where something is expected and in cases where something is unexpected. They're ignorant of causality in both cases. Appealing to God's will as an explanation of why things happen, as some people do, doesn't help either, as the details of how that would work are just as obscure as the details of how free will works in the mind. Indeed, it would make God seem incompetent, creating a universe that is in constant need of tweaking and maintaining, says Hume. Now, Hume wants to give us two final considerations for part 2 of this section. Before he gets to part 2, rather. The first one is beliefs about universal energy and a supreme being will always be met with skepticism. There arises the strong suspicion that such speculations go beyond the ability of the understanding, beyond what is taught by the experience. So no matter what you do, talking about universal energy and God is always going to be met by skepticism of some people because they just can't see it. They're not taught it by experience. And secondly, the other main point Hume wants to make before moving on to part 2 is that we cannot even know about the causal force of our own wills, let alone that of God. Because surely it's easier to know ourselves than it is God, but we don't even know ourselves. So with this, we come to part 2 of section 7. And yes, we seem to have moved on to section 7 without me noting it, but there it is. So here Hume restates that we cannot do more than notice one event following another. We do not actually perceive the causality connecting them. The same thing is true in the mind. Therefore, we have no idea of connection at all. And words like power and causality are completely meaningless. We commonly accept that you cannot judge causality without experience, or just with one or a few experiences, but we also judge that given a huge amount of experiences, we can judge causality, especially in cases where all past experiences have been the same. We suppose that there is some sort of connection or power that is connecting the cause to the effect we expect from it. But this supposition only arises from the habit of our mind, the habit that our mind forms going from the idea of the cause to the idea of the effect. It's just used to it. It's nice and comfortable. It's like waking up every morning for a year and having a cup of tea. Well, on day 366, you're probably going to wake up and have another cup of tea just because you formed that habit. Now, this also explains why the fewer experiences you've had, the less of an idea of causality you think you have. Because you just haven't had enough time to form that habit of the mind, to get used to that habit. So Hume finished by giving us a definition of cause and effect, which is very nice. It's always very nice when a philosopher gives you a definition. And here it is. Here's the definition for the word cause. He says, a cause is an object followed by another, and whose appearance always conveys the thought of the other. And that's all there is to it. This seems like quite a strange definition, but I hope that if you have been following along, you can understand why Hume would give such an odd account. So, in short, Hume concludes, all proper ideas must have impressions. We do not have an impression of causality, therefore, there is no proper idea of causality. Or, in other words, causality, the idea of it, is meaningless. All that is present in causal reasoning is a habit of the mind. I think that Hume's own conclusion and summary is better than any I could give. This is really all there is to it. Now, join me next time where we're going to be looking at the work of Immanuel Kant. who revolutionized the work of philosophy through his reply to David Hume. So Immanuel Kant actually got convinced to not be a rationalist because of David Hume. So join me then. See you there.